Hey, U.S. History students, this is Dustin Baker again. This is Baker's Corner. We're actually going to do about 3 or 4 installments on our next major theme, which is foreign policy continued. We're going to be looking at American involvement in World War I, also known at the time as the quote unquote Great War. And I want you all guys to focus for a moment on the pictures that you see in the slide. And does anything actually come to mind when you see these images? It could be things that, if you've had a world history class, perhaps you studied World War I in some detail. You talked about weapons, you talked about key people, you talked about causes. So we're going to focus our attention today primarily on European causes because we're going to be spending more time on how the war is going to be affecting the United States and American entry. But this very short first session is going to be more or less the European causes. Why does Europe decide by the end of August of 1914, for the most part, with a few exceptions, to actually go into a fairly large scale war? And if you take a look, guys, you'll notice that you've got a lot of pictures that depict a lot of relatively new forms of weapons, or at least technologies, innovations. You've got the U-boat, or also known as the submarine. You've got the impact of trench warfare, which, by the way, is not entirely new, but the effect that it has on World War One, of course, is going to be very substantial. You've got, of course, the machine gun. That was a pretty important thing. And then also the introduction of the tank. I believe that was the British at the Battle of the Somme. And then, guys, a lot of you are kind of looking at some of these pictures down here, and you're hopefully thinking, well, man, you've got a picture of Snoopy, and then you've also got a picture of, if you don't know this gentleman, he is, of course, or was, pardon me, the Red Baron. So he was the famous German ace that we've probably heard of if you walk by the pizza aisles and you see Red Baron, pizzas and things like that. So there's a lot of pop culture also that is going to come out of this time period in some ways. And it will be a transition, keep in mind, guys, into the 1920s, which a lot of times in American history is known as the Roaring Twenties. Okay. So something for us to think about, guys, here is, and you might want to pause your screen and maybe reflect on this, and then we'll come back to it. But before World War II began, was fought, many refer to World War I as the Great War, right? So, do we know if we're going to have, another world war? And the hope is no, but we know that the reality is that it did happen. Okay. So what are some things that you maybe remember about the war that made it significant? Okay. And it could be anything from, if you learn anything about the massive deaths and casualties and the kind of strategies that were used, what are the causes that you might have some background on. So, that might be good to kind of create a little bit of a list, kind of brainstorm. If you don't really know much about World War One, then of course that might bring up some questions that you might also write down to kind of give yourself a little bit of perspective on. Okay. And so, again, if you go back to one of our last sessions, guys, on causes of the Spanish American War, we basically said that we can classify causes usually into both long term and also short term. Okay. And so I would say that any of the ones that you see pretty much on this screen, you're welcome to pause it if you need to, are going to be what I would refer to as long term causes. Okay. So these are going to be causes that don't exactly happen like an explosion of the main, or in the case of the short-term cause of World War I, we'll look on the next slide. These are over the course of time. Okay, so if you take a look, like these 4 major causes, and guys, keep in mind there's more to it than just this, but certainly these 4 tend to get probably the most attention as far as long-term causes. You got imperialism. Countries are what? They are competing over land and expansion. Okay. And so there's one country that I think I referenced in one of my previous lessons that in Europe has really changed that balance of power as far as European nations and even the world community. And that's going to be the nation of Germany. Okay. So around 1870, they fought Prussia. That was the precursor to modern Germany, excuse me. Okay. Is going to basically be fighting a war against France. And so they defeated the French in that war, called the Franco-Prussian War. And a year later, Germany officially creates a unified nation or state. And guys, if you can imagine how large Germany is going to be as far as its, population and also even its geographic size. And guys, if you're a European country like France and Britain, that for years and years have been pretty significant adversaries, right? They've not been on the same page. This formation concerns you, right? Because the amount of power politically, militarily, culturally that a lot of people have when they come together and they have a common goal. Okay. And so, therefore, this German state is going to be looking abroad, similar to what the United States is going to be doing by wanting to control areas, that are in parts of Africa and other parts of the world as well. Okay, so militarism. That's pretty much the way that it sounds. You've got an emphasis on building up an army and a navy, and certainly putting a lot of resources into building up basically your military potential. Okay, and so again, the goal here is that you're building up your military strength and power. Okay. And guys, I think it's safe to say that by the time that World War One is pretty much on the horizon, then what we notice, guys, for the most part, is that you're seeing the establishment of a pretty significant force that Germany is going to obviously, have, some people would say an advantage when it comes to going against countries militarily. Okay. Nationalism, this actually has two kind of aspects or ideas. The desire to expand your culture. So, in other words, hey, we have a culture that we think that you could actually benefit from, whether it's speaking our language or our religion or whatever you might associate with cultural values and things. Okay, and so what do we notice? There's going to be a lot of emphasis on that. Germany is not the only country that sought to do that. We talked about how America had that goal as well with imperialism. Okay, but there is a lot of thought about that. And then also, guys, with nationalism, this is also where the idea of independence, sovereignty, self rule comes into it. Okay. So it's a different kind of nationalism. You want to be able to govern yourselves. You want to have your own government, your own political structure, not to be as much under or over, excuse me, guys, the idea of another country or another state's rule, or shall we say their guidance. Okay, and so basically, you're looking at a desire for independence and pan-Slavism, guys. A lot of you are like, "Well, Mr. Baker, what does that idea basically entail?" The basic nuts and bolts of it, guys, is that in this period of time, remember, when you have imperialism, there's a big focus on empires and having larger states. Okay. So you've got, for example, Austria Hungary. That is a pretty significant empire, right? And you've got a lot of the pieces within Austria Hungary as an empire that is actually going to be making the effort to go out and actually become independent. So one of the groups that was really pretty big on that is a group that we call people of Slavic background. Okay, so therefore Pan-Slavism is a fancy way of saying it's a movement within parts of the Slavic community that are actually trying to gain their independence as a formal state. Okay, and last but not least, alliances. Guys, think about it like this. When y'all think of the word alliance, what usually comes to mind? I know for me, I think of the word ally. I think of the idea of countries or people even having maybe common goals of trying to protect themselves or even to kind of come together for different purposes. Guys, one thing to keep in mind is that alliances can be political, they can be economic, they can be military, they could be other ones too. But for the most part, guys, in this case, we're looking at military and political alliances. Okay. So these countries come together. You're going to have the Allied powers eventually. You're going to have the Central Powers. There were pre-World War I alliances that were already set, and we won't say much about these because of time. But guys, for the most part, these alliances are going to go through some shifts. Okay. So, what is going to be the real big, what I call the straw that broke the camel's back, or even the powder keg that actually led to World War One? It's going to be the assassination of Archduke Franz, or Francis Ferdinand, he's also known as, of Austria-Hungary. He's the next in line to actually become the heir. He's the heir to the Austrian throne, right? So he's the next in line. Okay. So he and his wife, Sophie, I believe her name was, were actually making a trip to an area that was controlled by Austria-Hungary. It was in Sarajevo, Bosnia. Okay. And so basically, you had a group of people that were pro, independence. They were a member, they were part of a Black Hand, which is a group that wanted independence. And a gentleman by the name of Gavrilo Princip, this is his picture right there on the right, is actually, he was 19 years old, so a pretty young man, but he basically is the one that was responsible, at least in pulling the trigger for the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Okay. Now, guys, ask yourself the question, how is this going to impact going to war? Well, if you're Austria-Hungary, for good reason, you're not happy about this, right? You've just lost your heir to your throne. Okay. And Germany is going to be in a pre-war alliance with Austria-Hungary. Germany, for the most part, is going to honor that alliance. And guys, Austria-Hungary, being very angry, eventually is going to want to take, whether it's revenge or whatever you want to call it, they actually want to, have justice being made. Ergo, they declare war. Other countries come to Austria-Hungary. To Austria-Hungary's aid in Germany. Other countries come to the aid of, eventually Russia, who sides with a lot of the folks of Slavic background. And what happens by the end of the summer of 1914, we pretty much have two sides. Now, this might be worth noting and pausing, but guys, the Central Powers evolve into an alliance that for the most part includes Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, which today would be closely associated with the nation of Turkey, and also even Bulgaria, right, which you tend to not hear as much about. Whereas the Allies, Great Britain, France, Italy actually started in a pre-war alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but actually around 1915, they're actually going to shift their allegiance or whatever. Okay. Russia is in the Allies until 1917. They have a couple of pretty significant revolutions, the Bolshevik Revolution, which is going to result. And eventually, guys, they go through a pretty significant change in their government. They overthrow the Tsar. And eventually, guys, Russia is going to leave the war. And about 6 years after the war is over, they're formally going to form what's called the Soviet Union, right? Which a lot of you have heard of. Okay, so you'll see the introduction of ideas from Vladimir Lenin, and eventually, of course, as you all know, Joseph Stalin. And then just a real quick thing that we'll pick up with on one of our future lessons. The next one actually is the United States does not enter until around April of 1917. Okay, so you have almost 3 years, okay, in between those particular original declarations of war and the U.S. entry. And guys, I want you to ask yourself the question for next time, why do you think the United States would maybe wait that long, right, to actually get more involved to declare war? Because it doesn't happen right away. There's going to be causes, again, short term and potentially long term. All right. But it's something to keep in mind. All right. We're not going to say a whole lot about the European strategies because of time. But guys, if you take a look, Germany already has, partly because of some of the bitterness that developed because of the Franco-Prussian War, but they already have a strategy that's been developed over the course of the previous 30 or so years that actually is going to be called the Schlieffen Plan. Okay. Alfred von Schlieffen, I believe his name was the architect of this plan. His argument, guys, was that Germany, if in fact they had another conflict with France, which World War I is a good example, he makes the argument. He says, well, the key to victory is going to be to actually making a very quick and decisive overtaking of France. And so as you can see here, they decide that they're going to, in fact, infiltrate or invade France. And the trick to making this work was for them to be able to conquer pretty much Paris. Guys, you can see Paris is right there off of the Marne and Seine River, or Seine River, excuse me. Okay. But the trick to that was being able to enter Belgium and actually be able to conquer Paris. And I think it was around 6 to 8 weeks. Okay. Well, what happened was they pretty much, to my knowledge, guys, underestimated the the ability of Belgium to actually put up some fight. And so Belgium, as you can see, is gonna take a little bit longer for the Germany to get through. As a result, guys, what happens that gives France and also Great Britain the opportunity to mobilize. What does that mean to mobilize? It means to move, right? So they're going to be able to actually get their troops and their resources. And what happens, guys, is you'll notice that Germany never conquered Paris successfully in this war. They did in World War II, but not in this war. And guys, what happens if you take a look here, if you've ever heard of the concept of trench warfare being, referred to as like no man's land and things like that, this is really where a lot of people call this a stalemate. Not a lot of progress made on either side, and the trench warfare takes place. And guys, a lot of you, if you're familiar with the casualties of World War One, it's pretty substantial. Okay, so this becomes an area, guys, of one of the key theaters, right, of this war. Now you have fighting, okay, and we're almost done. Just quick introduction, guys. You do have fighting on the Western Front. So, guys, you want to think directions. The Western Front is primarily going to be France. Key battles, Verdun, Somme, and Marne. There are several battles of the Marne, but we'll look at that in one of our future lessons with American involvement geographically. And then before the leaving of Russia, you're going to have the Eastern Front. One of the key battles there is going to be the Battle of Tannenberg. And then you're also going to have some fighting occurring in Northern Africa or parts or also parts in the Middle East. Okay, so guys, if you take a look here just really quick to show you the geography, you're welcome to pause if you need to. You'll notice, again, the River Somme. Okay, a couple other areas, but that's one that really stands out the most quite a bit. Okay, and so you'll notice like some of these battles, Ypres is here. Okay, you'll notice like the Somme River. Anyway, so you see that, guys. And then what do we notice about the Eastern Front? You notice again, Germany is going to be here, Berlin, Austria, Hungary, there's Vienna. So when they're moving in that direction, guys, beyond, they're basically moving, as you can see here, toward Russia. Okay, so Kiev, which is part of current day Ukraine. Okay, so they're trying to actually defend, as you can see here, guys, their land. Russia, as a result of this, is going to make a decision to sign an eventual peace treaty with Germany called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. That is actually going to give some territory to Germany that eventually they're going to have to figure out how do you basically deal with this territory that's been lost when the war is over. Okay. And that's a big thing, guys, that every ally, the French, the Americans, the British, and also the Italians, amongst others, are going to have to make a decision about. Okay. Last but not least, guys, the idea of modernization of warfare. Okay, so this war is going to be, historians debate this as World War One. The first modern war was the Civil War, in the United States, etc. You can research that and land your plane on it for yourself. But guys, at the end of the day, if you take a look at a lot of these weapons, or at least tactics as well, a lot of these certainly are going to be developing further as the war, as history moves beyond this war. Tanks, as we know by World War II, will be much more sophisticated in this war. There's this case to be made that they were more, kind of trial and error kind of thing. But in World War II, certainly they're going to be a fixture with military a bit more so because, think about it, between 1914 and 1941, right, which is when America enters World War II, even before then, you have a lot of focus on that. Okay, so that is Baker's Corner. Next time, we will actually start to look at the slide that you see in front of us, which is, where is the United States? What are we doing? And what are we actually going to be challenging ourselves to do as far as involvement? As always, hope you enjoyed this lesson. It's a really good introduction, basic introduction to European entry into this war, and some of the basic nuts and bolts of what brings us closer to American entry. Stay safe. Email me if you need to at bakerd@franklinlipcott.org. And as always, feel free to let me know if you have any questions, thoughts, or comments. Thank you for your time. Have a great one. Bye-bye.